An arrogant teacher tries to humiliate the school janitor by calling him up to solve a complex math problem, but is left speechless by the answer. Edward was a reserved man. His gestures were discreet, his movements always precise, and his speech came out slow, measured, as if every word was carefully weighed. He was in his 50s and worked as a janitor at a school located in a neighborhood where the buildings seemed more solid than the bonds between the people. His routine started early, before sunrise, and only ended when the last student left the courtyard. He lived alone in the back of a simple house, in a small room with damp walls and furniture he had refurbished himself during his scarce free time. Everything in his life was silent, repetitive, and discreet. He swept the school hallways attentively and respectfully, as if the sound of the broom might disturb someone. He carried buckets carefully and avoided eye contact. It was as if he knew that there he was more tolerated than truly seen. Widowed for years, he had practically raised his son Nicholas alone. At 18, Nicholas was in his final year of a technical course in another city, supported by a scholarship he had earned himself. Edward was deeply proud of his son, but kept that feeling to himself. He did not tell stories or seek recognition. The past, to him, was something stored away. He never talked about his previous life, not because he was hiding something, but simply because he believed it no longer belonged to who he was. At school, he moved around wearing a worn apron and pushing a cleaning cart, carrying out his tasks with precision. Those who saw him like that could never imagine that this man carried more than mops and cloths. He carried a lifetime of silence, losses, and knowledge. And he did all of it without drawing attention, as if his greatest skill was to exist without taking up space. The school environment where Edward worked was marked by a rigid, almost bureaucratic hierarchy. There was a clear separation, though never openly stated, between those considered important, teachers, coordinators, administrators, and the rest, security guards, cafeteria workers, janitors. Edward fit perfectly among the latter. One of the most emblematic figures of this posture was Larry, a math teacher for the upper grades of high school. Larry was known for his elaborate speech, the affected way he explained even the simplest concepts, as if he were always on a stage. He proudly displayed a diploma from a private university, mentioning his education frequently, as if that placed him a rung above others. He was the type who made a point of reminding everyone of his intellectual authority at every opportunity. For him, titles, positions, and appearances mattered more than empathy or respect. Larry rarely looked at Edward, and when he did, it was with the kind of disdain that tries to pass as indifference. A raised eyebrow, a sideways glance, or even an impatient sigh when Edward passed by with the bucket at the classroom door. Edward, as usual, avoided confrontation. He preferred to remain invisible. It was an ordinary Tuesday, the kind of day when everything seemed predictable. The sun was shining outside, and inside the classroom, Larry was lecturing about mathematical functions. He used elaborate examples, wrote quickly on the board, and made strategic pauses to stare at the students with the air of someone expecting applause rather than questions. At that moment, Edward quietly entered the room, as he did every day. He pushed the cleaning cart and headed to the trash can in the corner, moving smoothly to avoid interrupting anything. But this time, Larry noticed him, or rather chose to notice him. "Mr. Edward, what an unexpected honor," Larry said with a smile loaded with irony, turning to the students. Edward paused for a second, surprised to be addressed. He nodded slightly but did not respond. "Since you're here, maybe you can help us with an equation. Nothing too difficult, something simple. Something even the janitor can solve, right?" Larry said, grabbing the marker and writing a long, intimidating sequence of numbers and symbols on the board. The students exchanged glances. Some laughed, others fidgeted. Everyone understood this was a disguised provocation. Consider this a friendly challenge, Mr. Edward. A game between colleagues, Larry continued, stepping aside and pointing to the board. Can you solve it, please? Edward remained still for a few seconds. He didn't seem uncomfortable with the calculation, but rather with the situation. He looked at the students, then at the board, then at the floor. For a moment, he thought about quietly leaving, but he didn't. He calmly walked to the board, took the marker Larry extended, without saying a word, and carefully examined the equation. The room fell silent. Even those who usually talked during class held their breath now. Larry stepped back, folding his arms. Edward began solving. Every line he wrote was firm, direct. The students watched attentively, some furrowing their brows, trying to follow his reasoning. Edward didn't hesitate once. He completed the calculation thoroughly, precisely. At the end, he put the marker back on the desk, grabbed the cloth he used to clean the windows, and slowly erased the board. Then he turned and left the room the same way he had entered, without saying a word. The silence lasted a few seconds until a student in the back murmured, "He got everything right." "I didn't understand half of what he did," another replied. Larry tried to regain control of the class, but the tension in the air didn't subside. Something had changed. In the hallways, the episode spread quickly. Whispers popped up in the lunch lines, on benches in the courtyard, at tables in the library. "Did you see what he did?" one student whispered to another. "That was a very complex equation. He solved it like adding 2 plus 2, said a girl, impressed. Among the most curious was Dennis. Observant by nature, he had always suspected there was more to Edward than his appearance suggested. He didn't just memorize that, he understood what he was doing, he told two friends as they left for break. The next day, Dennis waited until the end of class. He stayed in the hallway, watching from afar, until he saw Edward passing by, pushing the cleaning cart with his usual calm. He took a deep breath and approached slowly, holding his notebook close to his chest. "Mr. Edward," he called out softly and respectfully. Edward turned slowly, as if expecting to hear about some problem with the floor or a routine complaint. "Sorry to bother you. I saw what you did yesterday in Mr. Larry's classroom," Dennis said. "It was impressive, really. I've never seen anyone solve something like that the way you did." Edward didn't answer immediately. He just looked at him with a neutral, attentive gaze. "I thought about that all day," Dennis continued, carefully opening his notebook. "And today, trying to solve a similar problem, I got stuck. I was confused. Could you maybe help me, if it's not a bother?" Edward looked at the page for a few seconds, then nodded. "You made a small mistake here," he said, pointing with his finger. "This sign should be positive, and here, rearrange these terms. See how it looks." The explanation came clearly, unhurried, and made more sense to Dennis than any lesson he'd had all week. "Wow, that makes total sense now," he said with a surprised smile. In the following days, other students began to approach, first shyly, then naturally. "Edward, can I show you a problem I didn't understand?" asked a girl, opening her notebook even before he answered. "Sure. Let's see," he replied, sitting on a nearby bench. In a short time, that concrete bench in the courtyard became a meeting point. Always at the end of the shift, small groups gathered around Edward, who explained with the same serenity he used to clean the hallways. He never used complicated words. There was no arrogance or hurry, just patience. The atmosphere began to change. Where there was once boredom and distraction, attention and curiosity emerged. Students sat on the floor, rested their notebooks on their knees, and asked questions eagerly. "Why does it change here when it's negative?" one asked. "Because the rule depends on whether the number is raised to an odd or even number." "Look here," Edward explained, drawing with his finger in the air. Over time, the students started wondering, how does this man know so much? It was during one of these explanations that Edward unintentionally remarked, "These types of equations used to appear a lot in exercises I gave years ago." Dennis paid close attention to that phrase. It didn't seem thrown out casually. The next day, he called two close friends. "Let's find out who he was," he said. "He's not just someone who likes math." They went to the school library, where the librarian always greeted them patiently. "What are you looking for?" she asked. "Old records, thesis, article, anything signed by an Edward with this last name here." She frowned, but went to a drawer and pulled out a dusty file folder. After some time, she pointed to a volume. "Here, published over 10 years ago." Dennis opened the cover and saw the full name. It was him. A mathematical thesis published in a national journal with graphs, references, and complexity beyond what anyone expected from a janitor. "It's really him," he whispered, unbelieving. The three hurried to Sharon, the pedagogical coordinator. She received them with a mixture of curiosity and impatience. "We found this in the library," Dennis said, handing over the paper. She read the title, frowned, then the name. Her eyes widened. "This is our Edward." Dennis nodded. "He helps us every day after class, teaches better than any teacher." Sharon didn't answer immediately. She took the document, read it again, then said, "I'll talk to him personally." The next morning she looked for him. She waited until he finished cleaning the second-floor hallway, where lockers always gathered dust, and approached without ceremony. "Edward, may I speak with you for a moment?" Sharon said, looking him in the eyes. He stopped sweeping and nodded silently. He was used to being called, but almost never for a conversation. "Would you prefer to sit outside, on the courtyard bench?" she suggested. He just gestured with his head and followed her. They sat side by side, with some distance between their bodies. Sharon held the folded paper in her lap. "I received something yesterday that the students found in the library. It's signed with your full name. A thesis. An academic publication," she said directly. Edward remained silent, expression unchanged. "Is it yours?" Sharon asked gently. "Yes," he answered after a few seconds. "A long time ago." "That's what I thought. The content is impressive. I don't understand everything, but I can recognize quality." Edward lowered his eyes, as if searching for some invisible dust on the floor. "It wasn't meant for anyone to find," he muttered. "It doesn't matter." "It does," Sharon replied. "The way you've been helping the students. It's extraordinary, and now it makes even more sense." He took a deep breath before speaking. "I was a teacher for almost 20 years. I taught at college, at technical courses. I liked what I did. I liked teaching." "And why did you stop?" she asked quietly. Edward took time to answer. His eyes were steady but carried an old weight. "My wife got sick. A long, cruel process. I lost nights, missed deadlines, stopped accepting invitations to conferences. I was always between hospital and home. When she passed, I saw no meaning in anything anymore, not even teaching. I was alone. I needed silence. And I found it here, in the hallways, among buckets and cloths." Sharon listened attentively. She didn't interrupt. "This job gave me peace. It doesn't require me to talk much, doesn't make me pretend I'm okay, and I still manage to help my son. The rest is vanity, and vanity tires. But now, after everything the students have seen, what you've done is changing lives, Edward. And I didn't want astonishment nor applause. I just want to finish my days with dignity and see my son graduate, that's all." Sharon stayed silent for a few seconds, then said sincerely, "I understand, but know that With or without a degree, with or without a teacher's badge, what you're doing here is bigger than many who have spent years in classrooms without ever truly touching anyone. Edward just nodded, without smiling. The news spread through the school in a matter of days. Not because he wanted it, but because the students themselves carried it forward. It was as if they had discovered a secret too valuable to keep. The man who cleaned the hallways delicately was, in fact, a teacher with a brilliant past. And not only that, a teacher who made them understand what had once seemed impossible. Larry was one of the first to react, but not with surprise, rather with disguised contempt. These stories are always overly romanticized. Anyone who memorizes formulas can seem like a genius in front of those who know little, he commented in the teacher's lounge, crossing his legs arrogantly. Did you see what he did with the students? That afternoon group improved on their last tests, retorted a science teacher. Repetition isn't teaching. Practice without didactics doesn't educate anyone, Larry replied coldly. But the facts contradicted him. The classroom where students used to yawn was now a place of questions. Students on the verge of failing started getting better grades. Math, once an obstacle, was beginning to make sense. At home, parents started noticing the difference. Dennis, what's happened to you? His mother asked, sitting at the dinner table. You've been studying so much lately. There's a guy at school. He helps us after class. Explains in a different way that makes you want to learn, the boy replied, organizing his books. His mother wasn't satisfied with the vague answer. Days later, she went to the school and asked for a meeting with the administration. I want to understand who this invisible teacher my son keeps mentioning is. Principal Amy, until then more involved in administrative matters, decided to investigate on her own. She didn't like making decisions based on rumors. One late afternoon, she went to the courtyard and saw with her own eyes an unusual scene. About 10 students sitting in a circle around Edward, who, with a paper in hand, explained something calmly and patiently. The principal approached slowly and watched from afar. She noticed the students' attention, their focused eyes, the quick notes. Edward spoke softly but clearly. He didn't use unnecessary technical language or beat around the bush. The next day, she called him to her office. Mr. Edward, I was in the courtyard yesterday, she said. I saw what you're doing with the students. I'm impressed. Edward stood, hands crossed behind his back. I'm just helping where I can, he replied. It's much more than that. You're teaching, and very well. They're good. They just need someone to listen to them. The principal looked at him attentively. I'd like to make a proposal for you to be officially recognized as a volunteer tutor. You'd have more freedom to give extra help, maybe even use a classroom. Edward shook his head calmly. That's not necessary. I don't want a title, nor extra pay. I just want to keep doing what I'm doing. But you'd have more structure. You could help even more. I'm where I need to be, Principal. What I do because I believe in it. I don't want the spotlight. She respected his decision, and from then on, a new routine began to form. Edward started splitting his time between cleaning and math tutoring. When he finished his tasks, he went to the storage room, a forgotten space filled with stacked chairs and old materials. He organized the place as best he could, brought a small table, arranged some chairs, and began receiving students there. In the afternoons, that corner became a refuge. The young people sat on the floor, on improvised benches, or leaned against the walls. They came with questions and left with answers. Edward, why does this equation have two solutions? One asked. Because its formula allows that. Look here, compare the terms, he explained, pointing at the paper. Does this relate to what we saw in class today? Another questioned. It does, but it was said differently there. Here you can look carefully. There was no board, no sound system, no bell to signal the end of class. But there was silence and attention. There was real learning. Over time, teachers began to notice the students' increased interest. The questions in formal classes changed. They were no longer just memorized repetitions. There was reasoning. In the courtyard, in the cafeteria, in the hallways, the name Edward began to be spoken with respect. He was no longer just the janitor. He was someone who taught, someone who made a difference. Larry tried to resist for a few weeks. He walked the corridors with his chin up, a distant look, and hands always busy with papers no one asked for. But the discomfort was visible. He no longer received the admiring looks that had fed his ego. Students avoided him. Colleagues who once tolerated him now merely put up with him. What gnawed at him the most was seeing the one he deemed inferior be recognized day after day without effort. One day, he entered the principal's office with an envelope in hand. "I need some time off," he told the secretary. "Personal reasons." He left the request on the desk, didn't speak to anyone, didn't say goodbye. He left the school with hurried steps, shoes striking the floor as if trying to assert some authority. But no one looked for him. No student asked about him in the following days. No one missed him. Without Larry, the atmosphere breathed easier. It was as if an old tension had dissolved into the air. Students expressed themselves more freely. Teachers, especially the more attentive ones, began rethinking their attitudes. Some even approached Edward with questions and requests for help. "Could you show me how you explained that function to the afternoon class?" asked a physics teacher, genuinely humble. "Sure," Edward replied. "Just see what makes sense to them. Every class has its own pace." The end of the year approached, along with exams, closings, and students' expectations about what was next. Dennis, now more confident, kept studying diligently. He was one of the most frequent visitors to the old storage room, notebook in hand, sometimes with 2 or 3 friends beside him. "Do you think I have a chance to get into that college?" he asked one day, folding a page full of calculations. "You have more than a chance. You have preparation," Edward answered. "I thought about writing about you for the essay. It's about someone who influenced our academic lives. And well, no one helped me more than you." Edward sighed, voice void of emotion. "Write with truth. The rest will come." Months later, the news arrived. Dennis was accepted. When he found out the result, he ran to the school, crossing the courtyard almost breathless. "Edward!" he shouted, holding the printed paper. "I did it! I got in!" Edward smiled for the first time in a long while, a small, discreet, but genuine smile. "You deserve it," he said. "This is just the beginning." Meanwhile, Nicholas, Edward's son, finished his technical course with honors. He graduated with distinction, praised by teachers not only for his performance, but for his ethics and collaborative spirit. At the graduation ceremony, he received his diploma standing, eyes welling with tears. "Dad, I'm coming back there. I want to work in education. I want to do what you do my way." Edward heard it over the phone, sitting on the edge of the bed in his damp room. He said nothing for a few seconds. "If that's what gives you peace, then do it." A few weeks later, Nicholas returned to town, bringing some friends interested in social projects. One day, they all went to the school where Edward worked. "We want to meet the anonymous master Nicholas talks so much about," said one of the girls as they crossed the gate. They found Edward as always, apron on, slowly sweeping the courtyard without hurry. Around him, 2 students already had their notebooks open, ready for another afternoon of study. "Dad, these are my friends. They wanted to see you. I talked a lot about you." Edward looked up, wiped his hands on the apron, and shook hands with each visitor. "If you want to sit, the bench can still hold 3 more. Right there, they sat, and listened, and asked questions, and learned. Days went on. Edward never stopped cleaning. He kept pushing the cart with the bucket and cloths, sweeping the hallways with the same care as always. For some, he was still invisible. For others, impossible to ignore. He began to be called in quiet conversations. The untitled teacher, the man who truly teaches, the one who transforms without raising his voice. The school, once marked by formalities and appearances, began to change inside. Teachers dropped their postures and started listening more to students. The hierarchy, once rigid, became more humane. It was as if everyone had learned something essential just by watching Edward do what he always did, with consistency, respect, and humility. One late afternoon, Sharon crossed paths with him in the hallway. "Do you realize what you've done here?" she asked, smiling. "I cleaned the front steps well, if that's what you mean," he replied with a calm look. "I mean the school, the people, what you represent." "I don't represent anything. I just do what I can and teach what I know. The rest happens," she smiled back, "and it sure does." Years passed. Edward grew older there, in that same courtyard, among those same hallways. His hair thinned, his steps slowed a bit, but his eyes still held that calm sparkle of someone who knows more than he says. The broom became an extension of his body, the cleaning cloth, a symbol of his silent choice. The students who passed by him carried his stories forward. Some mentioned him in essay defenses, others in graduation speeches. One or another sent letters. Many returned even years later to see him again, always finding him sweeping, always surrounded by young people sitting on the floor. The school stopped being just a building. It became a living space where greatness wasn't measured by diplomas hanging on the wall, but by the real presence of someone who made a difference. Edward never wanted applause. He never sought honors, but he received what few achieve: respect without imposition, reverence without idolatry. His wisdom didn't ask for a stage. A concrete bench, a handful of curious students, and the comfortable silence between one explanation and the next were enough. Because in the end, he didn't need to prove anything. He just lived and transformed. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, give it a like, and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos. See you in the next story.